go. Right, welcome back to Inclusive Design 24 2019, brought to you in partnership with our gold supporters Barclays Access and Intopia. Don't forget, you can subscribe to Inclusive Design 24 on YouTube by visiting youtube.com/inclusivedesign24 and hitting that subscribe button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ID24Conf. And if you have any questions for the presenters, tweet them using the ID24 hashtag and we'll ask them at the end of the session. A reminder that ID24 is a respectful community with a code of conduct available at inclusivedesign24.org.
Okay, welcome everyone. Next up, we have Marcy Sutton and Samuel Prue, and they will be speaking on the subject of engaging users to create accessible client-side routing techniques. Welcome.
Hello, thanks so much for having us.
Yes.
All right. Well, today, as Carrie mentioned, we're talking about using the process of user testing to determine the most accessible techniques for client-side routing. So a bit of introductions. Take it away, Sam.
Hi, I'm Sam Prue. I'm the community manager at our company called Fable Tech Labs. And by the way, I'd like to give a big shout out to everyone who's just a couple of floors below me at the ID24 Toronto event that we are hosting. Thanks everyone for coming and showing up. So a little bit about me. I was born completely blind, and I was lucky enough that my father was also completely blind and worked at IBM for 30 years. And so I, from a very young age, was inculcated with a love of gadgetry and technology. And another thing that I'm also extremely passionate about is bringing people together online in community to advocate with one another. And I've been doing that for many years, from mailing lists back in the day to IRC. And these days, a lot of it takes place on Reddit.
Cool. Well, thanks, Sam. I'm Marcy Sutton. I'm the head of learning at Gatsby. I've worked in accessibility for probably 7 or 8 years or so. But now I've gone back to the mainstream to work on a website framework called Gatsby. And we'll talk a little bit about what Gatsby does and how it applies to client-side routing. But I'm super excited to be here for Inclusive Design 24. This is a great event to spread the accessibility knowledge to everyone around the world and from the convenience of wherever people can tune in. So about this talk, this is a sort of distilling of the user research that I conducted earlier this year with Fable Tech Labs. There's a blog post on Gatsby's blog. It's gatsbyjs.org. You go to the blog section. You can find my post from July on user testing of accessible client-side routing. So in this talk, we're going to go through that journey of what is accessible client-side routing. And we'll talk about the solutions that sort of evolved through the user testing effort that I conducted with Gatsby and Fable. We'll talk about the process of user testing and how you can have a successful outcome, and then where this stuff is going. So what's coming next in addition to what we uncovered through this effort. So here's the blog post on Gatsby's website. It's called What We Learned from User Testing of Accessible Client-Side Routing Techniques with Fable Tech Labs. And I go through in detail in the post about all of, basically a written blog version of all of the notes that I took through the user testing process, which we'll talk about today. And I will say that the blog post is sort of a starting point. So what I recommended in the post is just the start of where this testing is going. And so it's sort of a way to learn about what we uncovered in this user testing as we make improvements and recommended solutions in the future. So what is client-side routing? Fortunately, a couple of sessions ago, there was a great talk from Seth Kane about single-page applications. And some of this is a bit of an overlap, but we're diving into one specific part of single-page applications, which is client-side routing. So in web pages and web applications that have JavaScript, if there's routing involved in that JavaScript, it takes over the page changes, which traditionally would be handled with HTML and those page refreshes where your focus is sent back to the top of a page. With JavaScript, it's sort of hijacking that process and controlling how views in web pages are actually rendered, and your focus may not move anywhere unless you explicitly handle it. Gatsby is a modern web framework that's built with React.js, and it uses the Reach Router library under the hood. So the way that Gatsby works is it will compile static HTML pages by default, even though they're originally written with React.js components. But what's nice then is if users turn JavaScript off, there's still a website there, and it still works without JavaScript being required for the most default use cases. What's unique about Gatsby here from traditional web pages is that it does have this React.js runtime, and it will do what's called hydration and convert those static HTML pages into a full JavaScript rendered web application using React. So it's sort of the best of both worlds for performance and accessibility purposes. But the mechanics of how this client-side routing works in Gatsby has had some challenges recently. And so to make sure that this is actually working for users of assistive technology and users with disabilities, I really wanted to dig into how this is all working and try to present some recommended techniques and get them in front of users so that it's what we're recommending isn't just based on my opinion or other people in the industry, but rather looking to actual users who are affected by these mechanics and make some better recommendations. So I asked this question: which client-side routing techniques are the most ergonomic and intuitive to users with disabilities? And do any of the techniques present barriers? And so this question, I was holding it in my mind throughout the user testing process, and it will come up again later. So let's step through this a little bit and talk about how this process went for user testing. So Sam.
So that turns it over to me to talk a little bit. I've introduced myself and talked about myself, but now I'll talk a little bit about what we do here at Fable Tech Labs, because we really know and strongly believe that it is very important to get users with real lived experiences with disabilities involved in the testing process from the very beginning, and involved in the research process, and involved in really helping developers and UX folks understand what the experience is like for us. Because many of us, of course, have been using screen readers or magnification software or our voice dictation software for years and years and years. And we've developed a lot of expertise in working with that technology and in working with that software. So it's much better, we believe, to get users involved in the design process and in the research process, to talk to developers and to talk to user designers about their actual lived experience. But one of the challenges, of course, from that is that users are experts in our assistive technology, and we spend a lot of time learning how to use it and knowing how to use it. But what users generally aren't is we generally aren't developers. And so one of the things that it's important for us to really make sure that we do here at Fable is to build that bridge and to make it easy for developers like Marcy to get in touch with users, to really understand their experiences and do research with them, without them having to know what client-side routing and reachability and all this stuff is, because most users aren't developers, and nor should they need to be in order to get the best user experience data. And so one of the ways that we do that, and this is the way that we did it with Marcy, is we make it easy through our platform for companies to schedule a meeting with a user that has audio and video, so that you can actually talk to the user and watch them perform an experience and really see the actual mechanics behind what's going on and what are they doing and what are they trying and what's happening as a result. And not only that, it's a meeting online, so you can actually talk to them and ask them questions, and not only ask them questions, but have them tell you what they're thinking and what's going on in their minds and what they're trying as they perform a particular experience. And as I'm sure Marcy will show a lot later as we go on through this talk and talk about solutions, that can be extremely valuable to anyone who's sort of wondering what this experience is like and how do people with actual disabilities really use all of this wonderful technology that we have. And so as an introduction, as a next step, I'd like to talk about some of the common accessibility barriers that I myself, as someone who's completely blind and using a screen reader, as well as other members of our community, often experience when we're using these sort of client-rendered applications. And so there's a few. One of the big ones that we're going to talk about a lot is focus management. So when you press enter on a link or you click on a link, you really need your focus to be moved to a sensible and a correct spot on the page. And that helps in a number of ways. If you're a screen reader user, when you say click a link in a menu to load a new page, moving focus to the new page content that has been loaded, it's really helpful to know that the page is updated and to make sure that you're in a sensible spot. For magnification users, it helps eliminate scrolling and it helps them see that something has changed that might be out of the focus of their magnification. And sort of that gets on to the other barriers that we often experience, which is in a client-rendered application, just a complete lack of communication. So when you click a link, you don't notice that something has happened. You don't know that anything maybe has changed and you think it just did nothing. And another barrier that we have on a lot of these applications, of course, is making sure that the markup is correct. For a screen reader user, that all of these things have either been marked with semantic HTML or with ARIA as a link or as a button or as a control, because screen reader users need to know that it's something that they can click, and voice activation users need to be able to clearly tell their software that this is the control that I think it is and that it appears to be visually, and this is what I want to click on. So now that I've talked about a few of the barriers, I'll turn it over to Marcy to start talking about finding solutions to these problems.
Yeah, sure. And one more thing I would add is that when we talk about client rendering, that's talking about JavaScript as the client. So it's essentially taking over some of the behavior that a browser traditionally would have done. And so because of these common accessibility barriers in ubiquitous web applications throughout the web, I really wanted to find a solution that could be recommended in general. So not just for Gatsby, but potentially for other JavaScript frameworks, for developers of web applications, maybe even something in the browser standard space. Is there something that evolves as a clear winning solution to support users with disabilities that we can actually recommend? So that's what I was keeping in my mind as I went through this process with Fable. And I took extensive notes, and that's really what informed, how this process went. So in talking about working with Fable, maybe Sam, you talked about this a little bit, but talking about, how Fable actually works. If there's anything you want to add on that part.
Yeah, sure. So again, the way that Fable actually works is you as a researcher or as a developer can specify what kind of research that you would like to do. So perhaps you'd like to have a meeting with someone who uses voice dictation, or somebody who uses magnification, or somebody who uses a screen reader. And the way we work is that you can log into our website, and we'll help you get an actual video meeting between yourself and this other person scheduled, and that is actually recorded, so that not only can you take notes, you can look back on it later, which I'm sure for a lot of you is very important. And during the meeting, the user would share their screen with you, so you'd be able to see everything that's on their screen. You'd be able to see them, and you'd be able to hear their screen reader audio, if any, if that's what they're doing. And you can also just have a conversation with them as you ask them to perform various tasks.
Yeah, that really was helpful for me to be able to, like, the Fables testing community was really great about talking through what they were doing, which, you know, sometimes depending on the setup, the technology being used, and, you know, having this go virtually through Zoom, sometimes, you know, I couldn't actually see what was happening, but the testers did a great job of talking me through that process. And the nice thing about it being interactive is that I could ask follow-up questions of like, what was that combination of tech you had? And then I could write down the note, and that helped me to form my results, you know, what I was compiling to talk about later on. Having that interactive, you know, one-on-one experience was super helpful, so that I could ask qualifying questions and get more information.
Yeah, so you performed, as is detailed in your blog post, several user tests with a large kind of cross-section of users with various disabilities, because it's important for me as someone who's blind, and for all of us here, to remember that accessibility doesn't just stop at screen readers. It's magnification, it's voice dictation, it's on-screen keyboards, it's everything else. So after you did all this community testing, and you said you took a whole pile of notes, how did you synthesize the results and put it all together? And were you left feeling more confused, or were you actually kind of feeling informed and empowered at the end of it?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I kept a notebook of notes, and that'll be really fun to look back on, you know, as time passes, to go find those details. But that provided a really great outline for my blog post, actually. I could go through each test and pick out little details that, you know, maybe were nuanced, that I, you know, weren't sticking in the forefront of my mind. And having those notes was super helpful, because it did leave me feeling, you know, informed and inspired. And it's sort of a pull and a tension as each test went on. I could see where the, you know, similarities were and where the needs of each user differed. And so by the end of the experience, I tried to distill that all down into things that were common, that I could try and serve a range of users with one solution, knowing that it is really hard to serve every single user with the same solution. So it's always going to be, you know, a source of improvement that we can keep working on. But in this case, from these tests, I actually did find some common ground, and that felt really successful.
That's good, because I know sometimes you can feel like you're pulled in a couple different directions, right? Where one solution makes it better for one set of users and maybe not as good for another.
Mm-hmm.
So after you did all this testing and you looked over the results, were you able to go straight from user testing to a tangible set of goals and solutions, or was there kind of more work to be done even after user testing?
I went pretty much, I mean, I went into the testing with prototypes, and we'll talk a little bit about the testing methodology in a moment. But I went into this with things for people to test. And so it was sort of like looking at, you know, things laid out on a table, and which pieces do you pick up and use, and which do you, you know, leave alone. And I was able to go from the user testing to recommending something. It has evolved a little bit since then, which we'll check out a little later. But I think the user testing, because I went in with a question to be answered and prototypes to be evaluated, it set me up pretty well to have some answers without needing to do much more research.
Yeah, I can definitely say from the tester side and from the community side that having a very goal-driven approach like that, and knowing what you want to know and what you want to find out, can be very powerful when you're talking about user testing. Because I'm sure if you put yourself in the chair of a user and empathize for a moment, and someone walked up to you with a complicated website and said, "Tell me about everything. Tell me everything that's wrong," that can be just a little bit overwhelming, you know? And so that's a really helpful, can be one of many really helpful approaches. So when you do your next round of user testing, because as you've said, there's always more work to be done, what do you plan to do differently, and what worked well for you?
I think the biggest lesson that I learned was not to lead the tester to the answer. Like, it's sort of a fine balance between informing them of what the goal of the test is supposed to be and not leading them to a resolution or an opinion. And that's an art, really. I mean, reading about books like Just Enough Research by Erica Hall, that's more of a general testing experience of like gathering data when you're trying to build a product or something. And you do want somewhat of open-ended questions in those cases, but for these tests, it was pretty specific about these technological solutions. So it's this fine balance of like informing the tester of what they're evaluating, but not leading them to the answer. So that's something I would continue to work on, just so that I'm not like, I want the tester to step through a prototype and give me their honest assessment without like affecting their experience too much. So it's kind of tricky. But what I do think worked well, as we mentioned, was having a question to be answered. And in this case, it was about, do any of these techniques present barriers to your experience? And the testers would actually reference that question, or I think there's 2 questions in there. They would ask the question aloud and then answer it with, well, yeah, this does present barriers. And especially in the cases where I had admittedly my own biases, after all the years I've been working in accessibility, I tried to set these tests up to be as accessible as possible, but I still had my own biases, and it was surprising. So I think the experience of seeing where those biases was valuable, and but having that question to be answered, I feel like that worked well.
Yeah, that is one of the things that we do on Fable, is we get people to sort of describe what their goals are so that the tester has a framework and knows what's going on. So before we move on and start to talk about actual prototypes and testing methodology as we move towards a solution, I'd just like to take a moment to give Gatsby an enormous thanks for working with us and for partnering with us in this testing process, because it's so important to be committed to accessibility, and Gatsby has really shown that commitment, especially on the part of a company that develops a framework solution. Because every accessibility improvement that you can make to a framework trickles down to hundreds of thousands of websites without too much effort on their part. And so every improvement that Gatsby as a framework can make can really have a magnified effect on the entire world and the online experience for people living with disabilities.
Well, thanks, Sam. We're not perfect, and I'll talk a little bit about, where we're at and where we're going a little later in the talk. But I think having that commitment to seeking feedback and making improvements, no matter, whatever is actionable in those, in that bit of feedback, is really important. And so we do try to embrace feedback in all forms, and accessibility feedback is super important. So let's talk a little bit about how these tests went. So back in March of this year, I wrote a blog post on my personal website, marcysutton.com, about these prototypes and this testing that I wanted to do. It was something that had been kind of tossed around on Twitter and through the community for a few years now. I used to work on the Angular team, so I've been in this framework space for a while. And I really wanted to get user testing, because otherwise all of the advice was sort of, it was boiled down from, advice that people working at accessibility vendors had found, and people remediating things. And there's some great, solid suggestions in there that solve some issues. But I really wanted to know from a user perspective, what is that about? And back at CSUN, Perry from Fable and I got in touch with each other, and I was able to get these 5 prototype web pages in front of Fable's testers. And that was pretty cool, because I had something for them to evaluate. We could look, go through the 5 prototypes. I think actually in the beginning, I may have had 4. And through the process, I was able to make some improvements to the prototypes, including adding ARIA Current to the, there's like I guess I could open some of the prototypes. We'll see one when Sam does his test in a minute. But it's a pretty basic web page with a list of links, and then it updates the main part of the view. And so making sure that whatever page you're on has ARIA Current on it can really help users of assistive technology. And then in general, I found that using responsive layouts and mobile first layouts so that, when someone zooms way in using screen magnification, that the layout of the page is responsive. In general, I found that to be very useful. So I did make some improvements throughout the process. So here's some of the takeaways, the findings that I tried to distill down and really overlay with each other to try and chisel out some recommended solution. For screen reader users, moving focus when those routes change or those views change will effectively announce the content. And that's a great way to do it in a way that works for screen reader users and sets it up for other users. Aside from, I could announce it using an ARIA Live region for screen reader users only. That didn't go quite far enough for other users. So for screen magnification, I found that showing focus outlines visibly when on the items focused is very helpful, where previously the advice was that it was okay to hide those focus outlines. It actually really helped these users. Also, focusing on small elements that don't take up the whole screen is useful, because then that focus outline isn't all the way at the edge of the screen or getting cut off. Again, using responsive layouts to minimize horizontal scrolling. For voice navigation users, again, the showing focus outlines, I started to see this common thread, and focusing on small elements was useful there as well. So as opposed to focusing on a div or a wrapper element or a heading, focusing on something small like a link or an icon button. For keyboard navigation users, adding reachable controls in all sections, such as a main content area. If it doesn't have any links in it, there's no way for a keyboard-only user to reach that section. And this is where focus outlines came up yet again. And for switch access in our fifth test, moving focus to operable controls. So moving focus to things like links or buttons instead of an inoperable div wrapper or a heading was useful. The showing focus outlines came up yet again, and then centering important items on the screen so a user doesn't have to tilt their neck super far. That was interesting. So lots of good tidbits in here, and I've outlined them more deeply in my blog post I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. So I wondered, can I distill these results into one recommended solution? And this is sort of a moving target because, I only got to work with 5 users here, and there's way more than 5 users with disabilities out there. So this is really just the start to a recommended solution. But I hope that we can, bear out some sort of recommendation here for people who are working with JavaScript applications. So I am happy to say I have been able to come up with something that I think will work pretty well. The first really concept here is that instead of moving focus across the screen to like a div wrapper or a heading, which is commonly recommended for users of assistive technology, I found that to support other users at the same time, that if we send focus to something actionable, like a skip link, that puts their focus in the right part of the page to actually do something with that action, and it's less confusing. Now, to make sure that we are still supporting users of assistive technology, the latest evolution of this recommendation, since I wrote my blog post, is that I'm recommending that we also use an ARIA Live region to announce the route change. And that's to make sure that when the page changes, we're sending focus to a correct part of the document, but also we're announcing what happened and trying to use that skip link to do both things, providing a name for the action that you're on and also announcing which page changed. It really just didn't seem to, add up to proper advice for accessibility. So with these two things, I now have another prototype, and I'm going to hand it off to Sam for him to actually test this for us live.
All right. As we hand it over here, just give me a minute to begin the screen share, and then I will give you a brief demo of the latest Gatsby.js prototype.
You have example 6, meeting control, system, example, close, tab, Rio, new tab control, maximize unavailable, example 6.
All right, I'm now in the example 6 prototype window, and I'm going to cursor up and down just to explore this site to see what we've got here.
Out of list banner landmark header link back to prototype list. Out of header main landmark main navigation list with 4 items bullet link current page home.
So I'm currently on the home page, I can tell.
Bullet link about. Bullet link portfolio. Bullet link contact. Out of list heading level 2 home link skip to main navigation.
So this is the home, and I've seen those options, so I'm going to go pick one of them.
Banner land. List with 1 item. Address insert. Main land. About link.
I will pick about. And so now I know I'm focused on that link, and I'll go ahead and press enter here.
New page : about. Skip to main navigation link heading level 2.
So it's told me that I've loaded a new page called about, and I've been placed on the skip to main navigation heading or link, which if I press that would take me right back to the menu. Or I can go ahead and arrow down and read the content.
Doggo small heckin' angry woofer very taste while pogo aqua doggo the sea.
Which is just great filler content that sounds extremely amusing when you read with a screen reader. And so I always have to do that whenever I'm doing one of these demos. And so, yeah.
Banner landmark. Main landmark navigation. Bullet link about.
Menu,
bullet link portfolio.
hit portfolio.
Link. New page : portfolio. Skip to.
And once again, I'm told that there's a new page and it's the portfolio. And I moved right into the main content where I'd be ready to arrow down and start reading it. So at least from the perspective of an NVDA screen reader user, this is a great experience. We've solved those challenges that I was talking about in the beginning of the talk. You can press enter on a link and know that something happened. You're told the link that's currently selected, and your focus is moved to the most sensible place where you're all ready to start reading the new exciting content that has loaded. So now that we've had a little brief demo of that, I will stop my screen share and hand it back to Marcy to share our
meeting controls.
Slides.
Mute. Stop share button.
All right, go back to sharing slides. Where are they? There we go. All right, so that was prototype 6, which I will reiterate is a prototype. I can already see some things that I would improve. Including, so focus is set to a skip link. And in my prototype mind, I made it look like a little link icon. You know, what that visually looks like, I think is going to take some customization and playing around with, okay, this is not actually a permalink icon. This is a link that will, when clicked, take you back to where you came from. So it's intended to be a skip link to help a keyboard user jump around the page. So the icon that I had used for a link is probably not the correct one, but that's the beauty of a prototype, is that we can change it. And in some cases, I did make changes between tests because if something was kind of rough, I had the luxury of adjusting it and improving it before the next tester would use. And so I'd love to get this in front of more users to make sure that this actually works and get some more feedback on it. And I'll give you some more information on how to provide that feedback in a minute. So for concluding and what we need to do with this moving forward, because this is really just the beginning. As we play around with this, various folks, out in the community, if you're taking these recommendations and putting them to practice, it will take some playing around with it to see what works. And I think the tension here is that when we send focus to something visually, I gotta say, the sighted mouse users in the group will think it's unintentional and go, well, why is this focus outline here? Or why is my focus on this thing? And so there will probably be some friction that comes up with the solution in trying to center the experience of people with disabilities and make that the forefront of what we're doing. There might be some pushback, honestly. And so I anticipate that it will take a bit of finessing to try and come up with something that everyone can live with. And this is potentially where making, personalization settings in your app could help improve that. For focus outlines, that's something I'd love to see give users control over configuring those focus outlines so that we can enable them for people who need them and we don't end up having them be turned off for everyone. So I anticipate there will be a little bit of discussion around these kinds of issues. So in terms of what we're doing in Gatsby for client-side routing, I'm super excited to say that we've hired a new core team member to focus on accessibility improvements, and that person is Madeline Parker. She joined us full-time last week. We were in London, have team meetings, so she's getting up to speed on what's happening with client-side routing in Gatsby right now. And We have had some issues with VoiceOver and NVDA, specifically Safari and VoiceOver. And so part of this improvement is getting a team in place to actually commit to making these improvements all the time. So as new assistive technologies come out, as new browsers come out, things that may have worked before with each release, unfortunately, could break. And I've seen it happen. This is where automation doesn't go quite far enough. We can't automate a screen reader to test this automatically. So we have someone on our team now who's dedicated to working on this stuff. So that's exciting. And our goals really are to improve automatic focus management so that when routes change at the framework level, it's accessible. That's an expectation for any website framework, in my opinion, is that we're not screwing up what worked automatically for HTML before. And so it's like the mechanics are there. If it's not actually working in assistive technology, we have more work to do. But the goal is to make that automatic so that developers don't really have to do anything. Like, don't let this be a reason why they don't choose a framework. Like, that seems like, something we can improve big time. But then going further, beyond what we can do by default of, maybe it sends focus to a wrapper element by default, just to make sure that the baseline, the what was recommended previously and what some of my prototypes touched on, make that work. But then, to enhance that, because Gatsby, the way it works as a website framework, and from really any framework, I saw this in Angular as well, is that the framework doesn't really have knowledge of what content is being rendered. So we can't always control, what's happening on a given page. And so some of this may need to be opt-in for developers. Like, what we could do as a framework would be to make a recommended component that people can use in their projects, make it super easy to do the right thing. And so I'm envisioning some combination of this automatic focus management behavior and some kind of an opt-in component to get that skip link behavior that I talked about, or that we showed in the prototype. And so it's really finding this balance of like, what should the framework do automatically? Well, it shouldn't screw up accessibility as much as possible. That would be nice. But then what can we recommend to really make a better solution than that default, and make it easy for people to do? Because I think, given the option, if it's a package that they can install or something they can pull into their project, a lot of developers will, especially if it improves keyboard accessibility and really helps users. I think if we get a solid API that really works and gives some customization options, that this could be a way forward. So that's where we're heading in Gatsby. And we'd love to have your feedback. There is an issue open on the Gatsby GitHub. It's issue 5581. It's been open for a while. It's about how Gatsby's routing originally was not being announced to assistive technology. We went through and added Reach Router since that was initially opened. And Reach Router alone does a pretty good job. It doesn't actually take this research into account yet. But it works in a lot of cases, and it's actually Gatsby's implementation that is having issues. And so that issue on GitHub captures kind of the current state of things. And now that we have Madeline on board, we can actually prioritize getting this stuff done. And we also have an accessibility statement on gatsbyjs.org. And the accessibility statement, and a plug for those, I would highly recommend any website create an accessibility statement. Something I learned from Lainey Feingold about, the value in those statements and giving people with disabilities all of the information that they would need, find it, aggregate it, put it in a page that's easy to find, and then give feedback channels for people to get in touch with you. Make it clear that feedback is welcome and tell them how to get in touch with you. And so our accessibility statement does that. At least this first version of our accessibility statement shows a commitment that we really seek out that feedback. And so if you're finding issues with Gatsby, we'd love to hear about it. That's part of our continuous improvement, that we're always trying to make things better than we found them. And the real reason I want to underscore with this talk, it's sort of a tension with like, well, why HTML is not broken, why fix it? I think my goal as a technologist and as an accessibility advocate is to recognize that web applications and JavaScript are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. Web applications, with client-side routing and these asynchronous updates are a way of using the internet that users all across the world have come to know and expect. For example, if you're, clicking a like button on Facebook or something, the expectation is that the web page does not completely refresh. And so users have gotten used to this way of working. And part of trying to make JavaScript frameworks better, from my perspective, is admitting that this is everywhere. So we might as well make them as accessible as possible. We do have a lot of work to do. I'm not going to lie about that. But I think I'm not just running away from it going like, it's not my problem. I'm rather diving right into the problem and trying to bake recommendations and solutions into the frameworks. And I invite other web technologists and JavaScript specialists to join me in that effort. So that's all we've got. Thanks so much for having us. If you want to get in touch with me, you can find me on Twitter at Marcy Sutton and GatsbyJS. We're over at gatsbyjs.org and gatsbyjs.com for the commercial side. And Sam, where can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, it's been an amazing opportunity to be able to present here at ID24 today and to be able to present alongside you. Folks who want to learn more about us and what we do and maybe even work with us can go to makeitfable.com to learn more about that. If you want to get in touch with me directly, you can email me, samuel@makeitfable.com. And you can also find us on Twitter at makeitfable as we host the ID24 Toronto event. I'm taking over the Fable Tech Labs Twitter for today. So definitely follow me and interact with me that way.
Nice. And I think that handle was Fable Tech Labs, right?
Yes, it's Fable Tech Labs. My apologies, I misspoke.
Got it. Well, thank you so much, Sam. It's been a real thrill getting to work on this project, and I anticipate doing more user testing in the future. There's other groups that do user testing as well, I know, in local areas. Fable worked well for us, kind of startup to startup. I've really enjoyed working with the Fable community and the Fable platform. And I could see more of this in the future because, like we mentioned, this is just the beginning for this sort of effort. And thanks to ID24 for having us.
No, thank you very much, both of you. Thank you, Marcy and Samuel. Kerry, have we got any questions?
We do. We have a few that came in, if you guys have time.
Sure.
The first one that we have is, how did you engage users from your client's target audience? Did you partner with local disability organizations to work with their constituents?
Sounds like a question for Sam. We sort of leveraged Fable's community. So maybe you could talk about how that community was formed.
Yeah, so at Fable, we have a community of testers that spans Canada and the United States, and that we're expanding internationally. We recruit all sorts of users with all kinds of different ability levels and who live with different kinds of challenges. We partner with organizations. We recruit directly. If anybody out there is interested in joining us, perhaps as a tester, you can find that information at makeitfable.com/community. And we really build our community in a lot of ways, sort of organically by word of mouth, because there's a lot of people with disabilities who have a lot of skills with their various pieces of assistive technology, and they'd like to use that expertise, and they'd like to use that expertise in kind of a professional fashion, because one of the other pillars of our community is fair compensation for skilled work. And so we offer our community fair compensation for flexible work, for engaging in this kind of testing. And we find it works really well in order to be able to build a community with vastly differing kind of technologies and needs and challenges, and really build that bridge between this community and between developers and user experience folks who want to do that testing and who really want to find out the experience and learn about it.
Yeah, I think that's part of the value. I'll just say quickly that part of the value in engaging with a company like Fable is they are doing the engaging with the community of people with disabilities, and so that means that I as a person like seeking out the testing, like I can look to Fable to handle that for us.
Yeah, that's excellent. I was going to just say thank you, Sam, also for pointing out the fact that you're paying your users, because I think sometimes people think of this as a volunteer opportunity, but we shouldn't think of it like that. We should pay all our testers.
Paying users is crucial. I mean, once somebody lives with a disability, whether they were born that way or gained it later in life, they have spent years learning the best ways to use their technology and becoming an expert in how they get around the web and how they use digital experiences. And that's a skill that should be compensated.
Yes, definitely an expertise that a lot of us don't have. So we're very thankful that there are people out there like that. So thank you, and organizations. If we have, I think maybe time for one more question, hopefully. How do you prioritize which disabilities to test for if you have limited time or resources for this kind of user testing?
Yeah, well, I can speak a little bit to how I went about it for this project. I really was able to look to the technology of what question was I trying to answer. And so I guess, really any user with disabilities perspective would be super helpful on this. I did focus a little bit on the mechanics of what was happening and how that would impact, things like screen reader usage and keyboard users. And so some of the assigning of community members was up to Fable's discretion, but it could help potentially to just look at where are the challenges if you can identify them. I guess that's maybe where biases creep in. Like, what is your understanding of the problem even relevant to users with disabilities? So Sam, maybe you can talk about Fable's point of view there.
Well, one thing that I can talk about is that designing things accessibly makes experiences better for everyone on the whole. But it also, as Marcy was saying earlier in the talk, a lot of folks have challenges in common. So for example, screen reader users really depend on being able to control your application with the keyboard. And so if you test with screen reader users, you can also, as you make improvements to their experience, you're improving it for users who need keyboard control. And users of magnification assistive technology really do depend on having the focus move to the right place and on being alerted when things change because they can't view the whole screen at a glance. And that same thing is important to screen reader users. And so I guess what I want to say is that there are some design changes that you can make that can help not only all types of disabilities, but that can help just regular users by making your application more ergonomic and more intuitive and easier to use.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you ever run into the opposite issue where you fix it for one group of people and then you actually introduce a new bug? Did you find that to be your experience when you're testing these prototypes?
Not in this case, but I think more testing is definitely needed. And that sort of tension, I've definitely experienced it working at DQ before. I've seen that come up multiple times. And so it's something that's always a challenge where, maybe we fix it for one assistive technology and then in another assistive technology, it's infinitely worse. And that's just always going to be a challenge. So my recommendation would be to try to keep things simple as much as possible. Things like not labeling to try and get a screen reader to speak something exactly a certain way. And part of that did come up with the 6th prototype that I made, in that, the timing and order of announcements happening, I couldn't really control. And so there will be some variation with different assistive technologies. But hopefully we can land on some common ground that does work for enough people that it's better than doing nothing.
Yep. And that's a good point that you made also, Marcy, that just like browsers and our CSS and our JavaScript and the way the things are rendered sometimes is slightly different from browser to browser. The same is true when you go from accessibility testing from one system to a different system. So, yeah.
Yeah, actually, one thing that comes to mind through a test that I did was that looking at the prototypes, like they were all variations of different, various techniques that get recommended in the community. And I remember somebody saying like, this is worse than doing nothing. Like one of them was like not working for a user. It definitely presented barriers. But then when I had the framework of all of the other needs of other users with disabilities, doing nothing wasn't an option. Like I couldn't just do nothing. And so I had to use kind of my, knowledge and skills of like what is not working to like try and overlay that feedback to come up with something that actually does do something.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think we will have to call time at this point, but no, that was a good session. Thank you for taking the time and coming onto ID24 and joining us. Now
Thanks for having us.
Oh, thank you. Now for the audience at home, if you like this session, hit that YouTube like button, and don't forget you can subscribe to youtube.com/inclusivedesign24 for future notifications. A reminder that Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you with thanks to our gold supporters, Barclays Access and Intopia, our silver supporters, Adobe and Siteimprove, and our bronze supporters, Samsung Internet, DQ Systems, and the Paciello Group, and is captioned by MyClearText. Inclusive Design 24 will be back on the hour with Svetlana Kuznetsova, who's going to talk about accessibility for deaf people beyond video captions and sign language. So I hope I'll see you there. Thank you very much. One session I don't want to mess up.
Oh, I know. I'm worried. Well, not worried, but half worried. Yeah.